Okay, before we get started, I would recommend that you go to the video description, and in the video description, grab the GitHub link to this documentation, which has all those materials and all the videos, subsequent videos. In this series, we're going to deploy the Active Directory Platform as a Service option across all three major cloud providers. And so what we're going to do is do in AWS, an AWS Directory Service. We're going to do in Azure, the intra-domain services, also known as Active Directory Domain Services. And then we're going to use the Google Managed Microsoft AD and Google Cloud. And so what we're going to do is first set up the networks required to deploy these, and they're different across all three providers, and we'll go over exactly what the network requirements are. Then you actually go and you deploy the directory after you've created the network. And then once we've done that, what we're going to do is spin up a Linux server and spin up a Windows server. And when the Windows server starts, it's going to end up creating 4 users and 4 groups that are POSIX Linux compliant that set the GID number, UID number necessary for those users to be accessed concurrently from both Windows and Linux. We use SSD for that to authenticate users on Linux. We use a LDAP mode for Azure, and then we use a direct AD connect. And once we join the domain servers, we're going to run that script that's going to create the users, at least for Azure and GCP. It's required that you create a custom OU for your users, and we'll walk through that. And when we create those accounts and the AD join counts, we're going to take all those credentials and we're going to stuff them into Secrets Manager, Key Vault, and Google Secret Manager so that when we have these join scripts, they will not be hard-coded. The passwords and credentials will not be hard-coded. They'll be using the credentials from the Secrets Manager to communicate that between both the users and the boot scripts. And the idea is we're using Terraform and shell scripts to have a push button install. So you should be able to just run the apply, and provided that you've met the prerequisites, which are pretty basic, you should be able to deploy end-to-end an Active Directory platform as a service option on all three cloud providers, and then a Linux VM and a Windows VM joined to that domain ready to be logged into. And so again, we're focusing on platform as a service, and the idea behind platform as a service is that you don't provision the domain controllers, replication availability within a region handled for you, operating system patching is handled for you, backup and recovery is managed for you, and there's specific monitoring built into the tools. And so they manage the Active Directory infrastructure, spin it up, and then you're responsible for user group management, OU structure, if you're going to have GPOs, joining instances to domains. And so that's platform as a service is done on several things. The entry point in the cloud is infrastructure as a service, where they just give you, here's a server. Platform is one level up, where the cloud provider is giving you functionality and you don't have to worry about certain things. It's not quite serverless, because there are servers here, and it's pretty easy to tell where the domain controllers are based on the different providers. So, I have a feature comparison. They're all very similar. Once you provision it, you're going to get a full managed AD. There's some differences around where they exist in the networking. There's some costing differences. And how you get the initial AD admin password is probably the first. If you're doing this for the first time, that's like where you're scratching your head. AWS is easy, but Azure and GCP just a little bit obtuse for how you manage that initial join admin password. And we'll go through each one and show you here's how you do it on each cloud provider. And so we've got some feature comparisons. Um, you got the AWS directory solution, and we have a diagram for what we're going to build. We're going to do it in US East 2. We're going to build a subnet, 2 subnets in our VPC, and AD is going to be balanced between those subnets. Subnets in AWS are typically segmented by availability zone or data center, and so you need a separate subnet to get that high availability to have it in 2 different data centers. So when you end up deploying, you get domain controller and two domain controllers in each subnet that you provide, or one domain controller. You get two subnets or two domain controllers in total with AWS. And then we spin up a Windows instance. And in that Windows instance, in the boot script, we join to the domain. We create some users and groups. We store all our credentials and secrets. Linux, it boots up. It gets the join credentials out of the secrets manager, and then it joins. So it seems fairly simple, but there's a lot of moving parts here. And then once you have this infrastructure up and running, you can do all sorts of things. You can replicate your AD, you can spin up more instances, you can connect workspaces to them. So this is just sort of an entry point into getting a managed domain within AWS. So that's AWS. The initial admin credentials for AWS are dirt simple, and because you just specify the password and the Terraform, and then it sets it, and then we put it in the secrets. And so, which, AWS in the grand scheme of things gives you the closest to just deploying a domain controller yourself. It gives you full access to everything in the domain, which means you can screw it up. I mean, their strategy for deleting the admin is it has a comment says do not delete this credentials. Um, so there's some possibility with shenanigans here because you have full control of the domain. Um, so again, the use cases really are you've got a legacy, more of a traditional like desktop environment that you need to hook into. That's what it's good for. And so all three of you give you this sort of ability to within the cloud quickly spin up a domain controller. Domain controller is an Active Directory, and then you can use it just like you would on premise. All right, that's it for AWS. Let's look at Azure. Azure went through some naming issues that used to be called Azure Active Directory Domain Services. Most of the documentation still calls it that. But a couple of years ago, they renamed the identity properly to Intra Domain Services. Near as I can tell, very few people actually use that name. It feels like sort of the Twitter versus X situation where the company really wants you to use this name, but everybody seems to be continuing on with calling it Active Directory Domain Services. So with Azure, what you need to do is you need to spin up a subnet just for Active Directory. And then what we did is we created one virtual network for the Active Directory. Then we put our Active Directory in that instances. Now it's multi-zonal. Subnets in Azure work differently than AWS in that you can have multiple zones in the same subnets. So what you do is you segregate subnets by function. So our function here are Active Directory in one subnet, and then our VMs in another subnet. The instances boot up, just like on the other one. It will create the 4 users and 4 groups that are POSIX compliant, and then it'll store the credentials in the key vault. The Linux AD instance, it doesn't quite join the domain because we use the LDAP mode, but it is effectively the same thing. It's using Active Directory as the identity provider, using the credentials that you need to log into the server with SSH are stored in the key vault. Alright, so here's where it gets spicy. The initial admin credentials, you don't set them. The way it works is there's 2 different types of identities. You've got the Active Directory identity, and you've got your Azure Intra ID or Azure users. They're your cloud users. And so they're really trying to push this model where they want you to use cloud users, and then they will migrate your cloud users automatically to your domain. So we'll show that. And so what we end up doing is creating this mCloud admin user in our Azure user list. And then we create a special group called AADC administrators, and that's what tells Azure when it spins up the Active Directory, it's going to sync it to those users, and it's going to go, oh, they're in this group, so they're an admin. And so it's kind of indirect, and the thing that's frustrating from a perspective of trying to have a push button install that does all this is that you have to, there's some module there that joins, and you're going to see it loop. It tries it and then waits 10 minutes and tries it and waits 10 minutes. It does that for an hour, and that's all because of this synchronization issue. It can take up to 30 minutes It usually happens quicker, but maybe that's because I don't have many users in my domain. And so, it's kind of neat what they're doing with trying to migrate you to a more modern identity provider like Azure, and then just using it to migrate into their Active Directory domain services. But for scripting purposes, it's a little frustrating. But I imagine in the grand scheme of things, it's a much better way of doing it than just having local domain users. So what we do is we do all this for you. We create a user, we make sure the admin group is there, and then we stuff those credentials into your secrets. So that's how you figure out how to log in. It's the same idea. At the end of the day, you're going to go to your secrets in your key vault, and you'll see the credentials there that have been stored. But it is a little strange. It takes a little getting used to, and then once you see it, it makes sense. Okay, so again, the primary use cases for this are you have a traditional slash legacy identity provider and active domain, and so again, it's a great solution if you're trying to migrate to the cloud, and there's it supports trusts and some other things. They all do. Um, so that's it for the Azure. The last one is the GCP Active Directory. This one, it's like everything with GCP is easier. Like it took me a long time to get the Azure one working because of all the asynchronous nature. It took me like a day to get the GCP working. It just worked very well. Same idea. You spin up your Active Directory instance, then you join two instances, and it does the same thing where it adds the users, stores everything in Secret Manager. The only thing that's unique with Google Cloud is when you create the your Active Directory instance, you give it a CIDR block, and so if you study it and look at what it's actually doing, it actually creates a VPC that's hidden from you. You don't know, and so it's this hidden VPC with the CIDR blocks that you've given it, and that's where it puts your domain controllers and everything, which is kind of smart because you could screw up like with security groups and firewalls and certain ports. There's lots of ports that have to be opened with Active Directory because there's lots of services. So they manage all that before, so they kind of make it so you can't screw it up. And then you go and you add an authorized VPC, and effectively what that does some VPC peering and routing underneath the covers. You don't see it. So, and once you do that, the authorized VPC, it puts in the DNS records for your cloud. So you just effectively create your VPC and put your instances in there. Same thing with the instances. The Windows server starts up. It uses the credentials in the Secrets Manager to get the join credentials. The join credentials, I guess we're going to cover that in a second. And then Linux, it does the same thing. It's going to boot up the Linux. It does a join like the AWS one and gets it out of Secrets Manager. So that's it for the high-level overview of the GCP. Admin credentials. Now this one's a little different. The admin account is setup admin, and that particular one, you can't do it in Terraform for some reason. You have to use this gcloud command or the Google console to set up the initial domain password. And so we do that for you. We script it with the shell scripts that do the apply. It pulls it out, and then it puts it in AD credentials. So it is a little irritating that you just can't set this in Terraform like you can in AWS. But at the end of the day, it's pretty easy to script and set that. And once you've reset the admin password, it exists forever until you reset it. So good practices. You would create additional AD users and groups for this, but this is just the initial one to set up. And it's the same thing, same use case as you have a traditional application or legacy application, and you need Active Directory and you just want to migrate to the cloud. This is a good choice for doing that. Alrighty, so what we do is we talk about these four users and groups, and we create these four groups and four users. And I've got mCloud users, and we set GID number India US. You'll notice I have some Indian names, I have generic American names, so I have two different groups there, and then I have a Linux admins group. And so this GID number, UID number, comes from an RFC from the late 1990s that says, here's how you do POSIX with LDAP. And effectively, Active Directory is LDAP at one level. It has a set of LDAP services, so that's how it integrates it. So if you want your UID and GID numbers to be set right, in fact, with TripleSD, when you put it in this POSIX compliance mode, you have to have it. If you don't have the UID number and GID number set on the users, they won't even show up in Linux. It's like they don't exist. And so we use TripleSD. There's another project called Centrify that does the same thing. But I usually start the UID GID numbers at 10,000 and higher because a lot of Unix and Windows, I guess it's Linux UIDs, are up to about 1,000. So at one point I had a project and I picked 1,000, and then I immediately got in trouble with SSM agent where it was like 1,001. So you need to set this so that they'll show up properly, and it's particularly important when you start using shared storage. If you want the shared storage and the effective permissions to be right, you got to have the UID and GID number set. Now, there are some options to SSD that will allow it to map it by SID. I don't recommend that. I've gotten burned on that before. Um, you can't control the SID numbers. The SID numbers can actually change over time, which I didn't believe until it happened to me. So you definitely want to set the UID GID number properly if you're gonna integrate with Linux. Alrighty, so let's do a quick demo. And I've built my Azure environment, and in my secrets manager I've got their credentials. Now I used Bastion to log in, and so I've logged into the server with the mcloud admin user credentials. It brings this up, and that lets me know, hey, I'm an admin, or that it's a Linux, that I'm in that AAD group, the admin group, and when it does that, it automatically makes you a local admin, so then when you log in the first time, it brings up the server manager when you're an admin. So let me close that, and it is joined to Active Directory, and we also install the Active Directory tools. So you go into here, and you've got your Active Directory users and groups. And you can see you've got your users and group. I'm going to turn on advanced features because that's what allows me to see the Git and UID numbers. So if I go in there and I go to, first off, this is Azure, but you'll see that the users are synced. So you have mcloud admin, that's what I'm logged in as. And then I created an OU for my new users. And these are the users that I created. And if I go to like India, and I go to attribute editor, that's when you'll see the GID number set. And I can go and edit it. Mostly you script it. And then you have Kumar, and as I go to attribute editor, you're going to see GID number, and then UID number at the end here. Alright, so that's it for what it looks like on the Windows server. The last one is the Unix server, and so we'll go back to my virtual machines, and I'm going to go to here, and I'm going to say, okay, let me connect with Bastion. Connect with Bastion. And I'm going to go back to my key vault, and I'm going to log in as John Smith. And first off, you just use J Smith, so I'm going to go and say J Smith. And then I'm going to take that password. You got to be very careful when copying the password. It's easy to get it wrong. And I'm going to go that, show that looks right, hit connect. And I'm logged in. I can say, who am I? I can do ID. It's going to give you those numbers we talked about. This means I'm connected to the identity provider. If I do get int group mcloud users, you're going to get all that. Get int group Linux admins. If I do ID a Kumar, ID Raj Patel, ID Emily Davis. You're going to see it resolve those user groups by the number and name. And then finally, because I'm Linux admin, I can go and do sudo bash. Who am I? I can also log in as admin. I can. So that is it for the intro. What we'll do is build the exact same solution with very similar options across all three providers.